You described yourself when you first spoke to Joe Rogan as quite an average runner, which I found really funny if you consider some of the achievements that you've had. But that
When you think about it from a professional standpoint, it's like you do have to get somewhere to the top or near the top usually to find yourself having like a longer career within it.
I think if you look at your journey through the ultra world, you definitely are one of the pioneers. And the pioneers don't really get the glory until down the line.
And the sport is really diverse in the sense that like skill sets do matter. Like you can't just anymore roll up to any ultra marathon and if you're really good at one, win all of them. One thing I learned probably midway through my ultra running experience so far was that if I just keep banging the same drum over and over again, eventually there's like a slight like dulling of just the sharpness required to really have your best day.
When in terms of running 100 miles, what are some of the different emotions that crop up inside your head?
Like an overly zealous amount of optimism early on because everything feels so easy.
What do you think are some of the most common emotional mistakes that runners make during a 100 miler?
I need to get to the finish line and you shouldn't be thinking about the finish line yet. Or they have like a set of goals that they are set out for the day and they're starting to slip behind like one of the top goals
Okay.
and they give up on that one because they responded to adversity too early.
Before we dive into this episode, I want to ask you to hit the subscribe button here on YouTube. It helps keep growing the channel and keep getting fantastic guests like this one.
Zach, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for joining. We've made the time zones work and we're ready to rumble.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
And nowadays, you're so well known for all your different feats in the running world, your coaching, your podcasting. But I want to understand a little bit further back and understand what drew you to endurance sports in the first place.
Yeah, it goes pretty far back. So I was very interested in kind of sports and just kind of being active as a kid. So pretty curious, my parents were they weren't like forceful, but they were really accommodating when I wanted to try something. And really the only expectation they had was that I was doing something. So I had kind of like the pick of the lot, as they say, to kind of decide what I wanted to do as far as extracurriculars went. And I tried like pretty much all the sports that I had available to me. And then when I got time to kind of take a peek at kind of track and field and that sort of a side of things, I started recognizing that I was quite a bit better at kind of the longer stuff, which at the time, I think I was in probably like 6th grade. So like the extent of distance running was like the 1600 meter or something like that. But, it was pretty obvious. Like, I would beat my friends in that quite easily and then get beat quite handily by them in like the 100-meter dash. And I think that was like one of the first signs in my mind that's like, oh, it's not just like, oh, you're good at sports or you're good at athletics or you're not. It's like there's ranges of abilities and skill sets within the different disciplines there. So that kind of piqued my interest in that, at that age, it's like you tend to gravitate to things you're maybe a little better at. So I sort of had that in the back of my mind.
Loop, don't we? We need that initial positive feedback loop to say that if you apply yourself here, you might end up with some level of success and not validation, but some sort of metric that shows, oh, I could turn my hand to this and guess what? Maybe I'll get picked for the county team or the school team or the university team. And it feels good at least.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And some sign of progress above baseline too. I think it's like, and that one maybe gets a little more motivating as you get older and you start having like multiple focuses or primary focus on things outside of sports, maybe where it's just like, the average person who's going to try to pick up running or something like that, they would rather not, I think, just spin their wheels day in, day out. They'd rather actually see whether it means they're moving from the back of the pack up to the middle of the pack or, wherever it happens to be. They just want to see that relative improvement, I think, too. But, yeah, and I mean, it was just a clear way to measure too, because, with other sports, like you could see improvements for sure, but they were a little more gray area. Whereas if I went to the track and ran 1600 meters or 4 loops around the 400-meter track, I could actually see the time at the end of that change. So it was like a very clear, like objective sign of like, oh, this is cool. When I do this, I get that. When I do this, I get that. And, in the beginning, it was kind of like, it was pretty like unstructured in the sense that like, I'd just go to the track a few times a week with my dad, and we would run an all out 1600 meter. And, and, it was like, eventually I started beating him, and then it was like, okay, cool. That was like a pretty cool day. I think for me, it was like realizing like, oh yeah, it's, there's like multiple areas of just like kind of advancement within this. And, I didn't take it super seriously though. I still was interested in, it wasn't my favorite sport even at that time. It was just kind of interesting to me that there was that kind of divergence, but it kind of gave that type of a sport or activity a big enough window in my mind to continue to explore it as I got older. So like in high school, I took another step towards focusing on that, where early on it still wasn't like my primary focus, but by my senior year of high school, it was like track and cross country. Distance was definitely like the way I was kind of structuring my activities to try to optimize within that. And then when I got to college, I didn't really have any ambitions necessarily with competition in college until I went to a school that had a really good Division III program. And I thought, well, if I'm going to be here anyway, might as well see if it's possible to get on the team, because I was still running, I was still exercising and things like that. So I thought maybe it'd be at least fun to try. So tried out for that team and made it, and then was definitely playing a little bit of catch up, I think, with my peers in terms of like what they knew and what I knew and kind of their background in training and things like that. But it was such a great learning experience for me to be able to kind of feed off of just their relative excitement. Like a lot of my college teammates, they were far enough down the road where they would be following like professional track and field. They'd be on like, it's just like when the internet was really starting to pick up too, where like, the forums started popping up where you could get on these different like websites and follow like track and specific runners and programs and things like that. And then just like the methodology around things too, where I describe it as like a transition for me from high school to college went from, oh, I have a coach now in high school who knows what he's doing. So if he tells me to do something and I do it, I tend to get better. Whereas when he tells me to do something and I don't, I tend to stagnate. So to me, it was like, that's about the extent of it though. In college, it was kind of like, okay, we're doing 400-meter repeats. Why are we doing 400 repeats? What is this supposed to do? And then just trying to learn kind of the different kind of training intensities and where they
explore
maybe
your
fit.
curiosity as well, Zach. Give yourself the chance to question these things. Given what you know now, what was the delta between you and maybe the students that were a little bit further ahead than you? Was it they'd maybe had more guidance or more support in those early days?
Yeah, that's probably it. I mean, I went to a pretty small high school, and it was, my teachers and coaches were great, but it was always until like my junior year in high school was probably the first time I had a coach who was actually like a disciple of the sport itself too. So like he came in with the energy of, I'm actually doing this. He was always like training for a marathon or something. So it was like he was actually like walking the walk. And I think that was just like a little bit of a later introduction to that, where a lot of my peers, they maybe had a parent who was a runner and was interested in the training inputs, or they had a bigger program that they went to where the coach was, maybe a former like collegiate athlete or something like that. So they just had a little bit better of probably a glimpse. And maybe they just were more curious into that specific sport. Whereas for me, like as a fan and a spectator, I wasn't following running. I was following like NFL football, NBA basketball, the more traditional sports. So not that they weren't, but they were also following the other ones. So I think they maybe just got exposure to kind of that like excitement from the fan standpoint, from the history standpoint, all the components that I think make a passion really powerful when you start kind of going all in on the different various aspects of it. And it isn't just like a one-dimensional motivator. There's like all sorts of different things that get you excited about it. And I probably was just maybe a few years behind them in that regard. And that showed up a little bit in kind of training and the structure, where an example would be like, I think when I was in high school, if I had done a 30-mile training week, that would have been a pretty big training week for me. Whereas a lot of my peers were doing 50, 60-mile training weeks by their senior years in high school, some even more. So it was like, I think there was just a little bit of catch up there.
I think it's why environment's so important though, because you were looking around and as you say, these guys were maybe doing 60, 80, 90-mile weeks and you were doing 30. Very quickly, your baseline expectation would be that you would try and do the same as them or work towards that. Whereas if you don't know, you never know. And
right.
it just goes to show that whether it was a role model or whether it's just being surrounded by guys that are pushing in that direction, like look at the people you probably rub shoulders with at the moment, Zach. They probably all do stuff that's way out there for the general population. And if somebody came into it and was like, oh my God, these guys are savages, they're running this amount or they're doing this in their business, it really does make a tremendous difference. And I've noticed it from the last 4 years doing the podcast, and I'm sure you find this as a host as well. You get exposed to so many people now that, and so many different ideas and theories and thoughts that they become more normal to you just all of a sudden because you've given yourself the time to be immersed in it. So I'm kind of like raising my game continually week by week, learning about all these different things, and I have to, otherwise I would sink.
Mm-hmm. No, you're right on. It's a transferable experience, and if you're willing to kind of pay attention to what went right and what went wrong within it, or maybe a better way to say that is like, how do you catch the trend a little bit earlier so you're not necessarily always catching up? You find yourself maybe positioned a little better, and nowadays that's even more important because I think things just move so much faster now, where like maybe not so much with the physical preparation. I think that's, biology is biology. So like there's certain things that just take time. But when you look at like building a business and things like that, the resources and tools out there and how quickly they update and how quickly they advance, and, different ways to kind of get the marketing for whatever you're trying to do on a podcast out there changes fast. So it's like, yeah, using those same kind of skill sets of like, well, who are the people around here who have really kind of invested a lot of time, energy, and passion into this and are doing it the way that promotes like success and enjoyment within it, and what can I learn from them? I think having that framework very much kind of cemented in like what I expected to have to do versus something I felt like I happened upon, I guess maybe, is it was definitely a good experience that I've been able to carry over in other areas too.
How consciously do you think that happens to somebody? Like when I hear you speak now, you're very rational, very reflective, very, I would call, self-aware. As a young guy, when you're thrust into this environment, you're like, oh wow, like do you just kind of go with the flow, or do you intentionally push towards it in the way that you've done now?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think I guess my biggest probably thing I think about now is like, I try to think about what are the opportunities around me and which ones are actually going to be things that I stay motivated with in the long term versus maybe something that seems exciting or maybe rewarding for the wrong reasons or rewarding for short-term reasons, and try to kind of pick those avenues. Because I mean, another product of kind of just the ease of access nowadays too is you just have more opportunities. So the number of things I could do versus the number of things that I have the amount of time and energy to actually do well, there's a divergence there. So I think it is kind of like identifying which things match that kind of framework of what running did, where it was something that I was, potentially a little bit better at, maybe genetically, than I was other things, but also enjoyed it, loved the process, found a way to kind of make it something that fit into my life, whether it was a job or just a hobby, and then figure out kind of how does this fit within my lifestyle, and then on top of that, how do I do the best job I can within it? And I think that's where kind of leaning on other people who are in those sorts of worlds. So it's kind of, there's somewhat of a narrowing of focus to some degree, but it's also like, I think getting good at recognizing what's going to be fulfilling in the long term versus something that's going to maybe be a dead end, even if I can spend a lot of time and be successful in it.
I think that's a great consideration. And as you say, nowadays, there's more temptations than ever before. We often talk on the podcast about shiny object syndrome. So you've decided you're going to pursue this online fitness coaching business, but guess what? You've just seen the guy that you've been following online for years is a crypto millionaire, and he's given out trading signals to join his group, and you're thinking, oh, I wonder whether that's the place that I need to go and spend my time, my energy. But then the next week you've seen your friends doing drop shipping and e-commerce, and he's smashing it with 6-figure months, and you've never seen 6-figure months. So you're thinking, what do I do? And I think when we ask some of those deeper questions that you did in terms of the longevity of this activity I'm turning my hand towards, that's where the gold lies. We need to think kind of in more kind of longer time horizons of, can I see myself really pursuing this for a long period of time? And if I look at you, Zach, over 25 years of pursuing this running game, it's something that clearly speaks to you on a deeper level rather than just, oh, this one time I managed to beat my dad and then I enjoyed the occasion.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing too is I think it's like finding the thing that you can like get interested in like all the different aspects of it and then finding what do you enjoy that you can plug into it. So it's like, if it were a scenario where I had to make my entire living around performances, there'd be not only a very narrow window, but not a very narrow window with, in most cases, a fairly low ceiling. So like, just because, I mean, it's a niche sport, ultramarathon running, even running compared to like the major sports are pretty small. So not from a participation standpoint. I mean, this gets into the business side of it, but there is a gap between the professionalism of running and the market that is there. When you look at participation, it's just massive. And then it's like, so how are like, gold medalists in the Olympics getting paid like very small percentages of what, people in sports that are way more recognized, but no one's really participating in them. Like, how does that happen? But it's like, what I'm saying there with is, it's like finding out like, well, where are the plugins here that allow me to continue to explore the different areas of running that I like things like training philosophy. What allows me to kind of be motivated to continue to explore that outside of just what works for me? Well, coaching does, because now I'm working with, like roughly 30 individual clients and group clients and, people signing up for consultation stuff that will all have unique problems that they need to solve, or very unique lifestyles and targets and things like that. So if I want to spend working hours diving into training philosophy and trying to solve some of those riddles on individual basis and things like that, then, making that part of my job is important. So, the coaching side of my business kind of gives me that opportunity to explore that side and not feel like I'm just like spending my free time doing it, but I'm spending my career working time doing it. Same with podcasting. If my idea is like, well, I've got this passion and this interest in running, how do I share it with as many people as possible and also generate interest in like my brand and the things I'm up to the degree where I can continue to have a career within the sport? It's like, podcasting fits that really well. Social media even does too, to some degree. It's like a little short-term version of podcasting versus the long form stuff that you get on this. So I think there's varying interests between those two things. I know for me personally, I prefer the long form stuff a little bit better, but it doesn't mean the other stuff's useless. There's usually like, good value in that if you just find kind of like what works for you inside of that too.
I think having synergy between the different areas you've turned your hand to is really key. And as you said, you've named 3 areas there where you've gone super deep. Whereas I do think there's the temptation for people to go very wide and shallow nowadays and do so many different things that don't necessarily complement each other. My background away from the podcast, I work as a sales director, and in sales, one of the number one skills is communication. So as I've developed my communication skills in my day job for many years before I ever hit recording a podcast, I was slightly predisposed to be able to do interviews at a slightly better level. I was able to do research really well because I'd researched companies or my prospects, and I was able to come to the fore with lots of facts and figures and kind of the behind the scenes of a Zach, whoever I'm getting to speak to. And that was a complementary skill. But then you sometimes see people do things that are so diverse and so different that there's not the level of kind of synergy for them to have complementary skills that they can really go deep on and become like masters. I think mastery is a term that we're all kind of interested in nowadays as well, Zach.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, there's just something really unique, I think, when you start building something and you take it to like a conclusion where you feel like, wow, I'm actually like really successful at this relative to the norm. And with a lot of things, you can do that without feeling like you're just like uniquely good at it too, because there are so many different things going on. If you spend a tremendous amount of time doing anything, chances are you've got way more reps than the average person. So you're going to exceed the norm pretty quickly and pretty noticeably in a lot of cases. And then it becomes like a thing of like, well, how far can I take this? And I don't think I'm unique to this. I think this is something that like when people really get into it and they actually find the path and they know what they're looking for from a fulfillment standpoint, really like just building stuff. They like to get something to like a spot where like, oh, wow, I can actually step back and really appreciate all the work and all the things that went into getting it from where it was in the beginning to getting it to here. And I think when you can kind of enjoy that side of the process or find fulfillment from that side of the process, it makes like whatever you're passionate in that much more interesting for you, especially on the day-to-day when you kind of get in, because there's always going to be stuff you don't really enjoy about different things, to get to the stuff you have, fun with. There's always that side of things. And in order to like kind of get through that and deal with that type of stuff, I think having that kind of like broader view is definitely worthwhile.
I think it's quite inspiring as well when you see individuals like yourself who've achieved so much. And I don't know whether this was fully tongue in cheek or maybe just being self depreciating, but you described yourself when you first spoke to Joe Rogan as quite an average runner, which I found really funny if you consider some of the achievements that you've had. But that's clearly an area that you've spent so much time and so much energy and so much focus that, quote unquote, an average runner has become somebody that is synonymous with distance running worldwide.
Yeah, I think to some degree it's like I grew up, and to some degree this is still the case. Like I grew up in an environment where running was like basically more your traditional distances, like Olympic distance type stuff. So like it was pretty clear to me at an early age, even like I wasn't going to become like an Olympic 5,000 meter specialist or 10,000 or marathon or anything like that. So like my view of where I fit amongst like the hierarchy of competitiveness within that was not like at the top of a podium necessarily. So it wasn't really until ultra marathon running that I got to a point where, I was breaking world records and, finding myself competing at like international level events and things like that occasionally, where it was kind of like maybe a difference in kind of where I fit within that group of runners versus where I had historically. Yeah, I mean, like average is probably going to be dependent upon what you mean. Like my lens of running is also probably skewed to some degree, where by the time I started like considering myself a runner, I was basically into college. And at that point, the community of runners I was exposed to were all like collegiate quality runners. So it's like average amongst them is probably like a little bit of an exaggeration compared to average of just in general. But when you think about it from a professional standpoint, it's like you do have to get somewhere to the top or near the top usually to find yourself having like a longer career within it, if you're looking at just the performance side of things anyway.
Of course. And what were the tipping points that allowed you to go from working as a teacher to the Zach Bitter that we see showing up online now?
Yeah, it's a good question. I remember kind of thinking about it through sort of a almost year to year basis where, I started teaching with no like ambitions to become a professional runner. I had barely even dipped my toe into ultra running yet at that point. And then in 2013, I ran a couple of races that sort of highlighted that, okay, well, maybe this is something I could be a little bit closer to a true professional within. The sport was still pretty early in its kind of current growth phase there. So there wasn't a lot of like legitimate professional opportunities. Certainly not like quit everything and just start training and racing in a lot of cases. And then like as I started kind of exploring some of the professional side of that as sort of like an add-on to my teaching career, I started getting a lot of kind of friends and acquaintances and people I'd meet at races just reaching out and saying, hey, do you coach? Like we're interested in refining our skills or figuring out what you're doing differently maybe and helping us kind of solve this riddle of training and racing. So I started just accepting a few clients here and there. And then I think it was by like 2015, I had gotten to a point where I'd had like a decent size number of coaching clients that without really marketing it at all. So that kind of ran parallel with kind of signing my first running contract. And then it got to a point where like from an income standpoint, it was getting sustainable enough where I had that option to step away from teaching. And it was also getting consuming enough where, working with people, one-on-one coaching outside of teaching, training and racing, all that stuff was starting to get a little too much to kind of sustain or what I felt would be sustainable in the long term. So I kind of had to pick a path. And I remember thinking, I actually wasn't, I was sort of kicking the ball down the road a little bit for probably about a year and a half, just always saying like, maybe I'll teach another year and then kind of give it another thought during the summer. And then I had a co-teacher who I kind of mentioned that to, because he just sort of just said like, what are you waiting for, man? And I'm like, well, I think I'll teach one year. And he's like, why? So then I was just kind of one of those weird moments where I just like, you know what? I don't know why. I don't know. I guess I just hadn't really asked myself that. So then when he asked me that and I actually started thinking about it, it's like, yeah, I don't really know. Like if I'm going to do this at some point, I don't know what waiting another year is going to do. So at that point, I just said, I got to sit down and just decide, like, is this a risk I want to take? Is this a journey I kind of want to go on? And I sat down with the principal that was at the school I was teaching at the time near the end of the year, and just kind of mentioned that I was considering doing that. And she said, she's like, look, go for it. If it doesn't work out, you can always come back. And I remember, I think probably like that was the reassurance I maybe needed, because it was like, I didn't necessarily want to go and like belly flop at the running thing and then have to kind of re-enter the workforce again under teaching and try to find out a spot. Cause I was in a great teaching spot for me. Like, it was the spot I would have I'd still be there if I hadn't gone into the running side of things. So just kind of that sort of like confidence and that sort of like encouragement from someone who was going to actually have a harder path forward by saying that to me versus an easier path forward was like, okay, maybe I'll give this a shot. I'll take it year to year. Well, probably more realistically 3 years, because I had a 3-year contract at that time. So it was like, I've got this window of time to just see if this works. But I thought, like, I'll just reassess at the end of every year. Is this heading in the right direction? Is this heading in the right direction? And if it was, I figured I'd keep doing it. And then after that first contract, it was still improving to the degree where it looked like there was a sustainable path forward there. So I kind of kept going. And like after like maybe that third year is where the sport started shifting a little bit towards, yeah, you want to have race results. That's still a huge value add. But like, it's not all about like winning races and then getting in magazines to draw interest to your sponsors and draw interest to yourself. There's also like ways to build your own brand. So
social media.
Social media and, podcasting was really starting to kind of become something I was interested in, not necessarily as a host yet, but I love going on podcasts. So at that point in time, podcasting, even though it was growing and it was kind of finding its space, it was a much tighter knit group of people. So if you got on a podcast that had a host that was very well connected within the podcasting space, you'd oftentimes get invited. It was just one of those things where, as far as like a meritocracy goes, like podcasting was great for it. It was like, if you put in the work and go on podcasts and, do a good job of being yourself and showing your lifestyle and stuff like that, and it's something that they're interested in, the other podcasters are going to find you and they're going to want to talk to you, because a lot of times there's a lot to unpack. And even though it's long form, there's like these podcasts, they have their own angle, where someone would hear me on a podcast that's focused on like training philosophy. And they would be like, okay, that was really cool, but I'd really like to talk to him for much longer about his nutrition approach. And I'm going to have him on my podcast to talk as that the focal point. So you kind of have these things where you kind of lay out the scaffolding of everything and then dive maybe a little deeper into like one or two things. And there's always something that you didn't dive deep into that another podcast host wants to. And that's just sort of kind of continue to spiral and grow and grow and grow, all the way to the degree where I eventually got invited on the Joe Rogan Experience, which is the biggest one. So it was like that was actually alongside like kind of just like, if I look at things where it was like, start modestly and just keep building. And if you just kind of keep doing it for the right reasons, those opportunities tend to kind of present themselves to me. Like that was probably about as good of an example as anything, where, getting interested in something early on before kind of like the mainstream was really interested in it, and really just doing it for the enjoyment of it, because I wasn't getting paid to go on these podcasts. To some degree, I was probably benefiting in terms of just being exposed to things, but even sponsors, they didn't really care about podcasting at that point in time. I remember I would talk to, the like athlete coordinators and stuff at different brands and stuff that I wanted to work with. I'd be like, well, I go on this many podcasts. Like, oh, that's cool. How many Instagram followers do you have? It's like,
they didn't get it. They didn't understand.
Yeah, they did not.
Yeah. I think if you look at your journey through the ultra world, you definitely are one of the pioneers, and the pioneers don't really get the glory until down the line. And I'm not saying it by any means you need to chase the glory, but the rewards should at some point come. So in those early days where you were doing the podcast and you were beating the ultra drum and you were explaining how you operated, there's less of the adulation, there's less of the praise. And then of course now it comes round, and if somebody thinks ultra running, they're going to think Zach Bitter, which is amazing, but there has to be years of experience and knowledge behind that, which makes you somebody that's worth talking to about that, rather than somebody that's suddenly just turned their hand to it and trying to make a name for themselves in something that's maybe more established now.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's definitely a huge payoff from kind of doing things in a way that was more of a like this is fun. I like this. Like, and when the way I would usually do it is like, if I'm doing enough stuff that would be considered like work, where I've monetized it to feel comfortable there, and then I decide to use my free time to do something that isn't necessarily a direct monetization tool, but could still be considered work. But I enjoyed it enough. I was like, well, I'm going to do it. And that was podcasting was the perfect example of that, as a guest, especially. And I didn't know that it was going to be something because now it's to the degree where, like, within the podcasting world, and then with a lot of people that aren't necessarily like deep into the ultra running world, there are people who like look at me definitely as a bigger, from just a performance standpoint, a bigger example than what you can find. I mean, there's people, and the sport is really diverse in the sense that like skill sets do matter. Like, you can't just anymore roll up to any ultra marathon, and if you're really good at one, win all of them. Like, we see this even if we take just trail 100 miling. There's two really big 100 miles, the Western States 100 and the Ultra Trail Mont Blanc. Well, there's more than two, but these are like two of the fairly unarguably, yeah, like those are the most competitive two. If you try to peak for Western States on the men's side and you win it, it's almost a 0% chance you're going to win UTMB, because other people will have said, I'll pass that opportunity and I'll spend that time preparing for UTMB. And then they beat them almost every time. And even like the women's side has always been skewed from a number standpoint a little bit. So there was a little more of an avenue there for women to go and win Western States and win UTMB. And we've actually seen that happen a few times. But that's getting even more difficult now, where now we have a setup where if you take the top women mountain runners and they would actually decide to like focus on one or the other, my guess is it would end up playing out that way, where the one who focused would be the one that wins, minus something out of their control or something non-related to their fitness ending up becoming the deciding factor, which can happen in 100 miles and it makes it exciting. But that's where the sport is. So, and I mean, that's two trail. It's like an entry-level mountain course is maybe how people would describe Western States, to like a more proper mountain running ultra 100-mile course as UTMB. But even that's a big enough divergence. So now you add in like the full scope of like, okay, you can be on a 400-meter track and run for 6 days. Like, and then you produce some number at the end of that. That's a part of the sport. Or you could go and do a 50K out in Utah, and it's all at 10,000 feet elevation, and you're running up and down scree fields and steep mountains and things like that. And that's ultra marathon too. But like the winner of either of those are going to be two completely different athletes at the end of the day. It's almost like trying to compare the quarterback of a football team to the wide receiver. It's like, yeah, one might be the best quarterback in the world, the other might be the best wide receiver. You switch roles and all of a sudden they're not even pros. So the sport is growing enough where we kind of have that landscape too. But like to back to what we were talking about, like someone listens to me on Joe Rogan, they think, oh, well, Zach's the best ultra marathoner in the world. They see some race over in Europe that's a steep mountain race. Well, if Zach did it, he'd win it. It's like, no, he wouldn't.
It's more specific than that. You've got a skill set that is aligned to others. But equally, I know that you've done your 100-miler across track, trail, and even treadmill. I think would have been probably a C19 period thing, potentially based on that. But that shows a level of diversification in your skill set to train for those. But I guess the exact type of training and tapering and approach to those was slightly different to all of those, because I mean, trail, for example, is going to take considerably longer. I know, like, I think one of your best trail times is like 17 hours, whereas you're infamous for being kind of 11 hours for your actual track.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I still love the variance, and the variance is what keeps it sustainable for me, I think, because one thing I learned probably midway through my ultra running experience so far was that if I just keep banging the same drum over and over again, eventually there's like a slight like dulling of just the sharpness required to really have your best day. So if I would run like a few really controlled 100-milers in a row, I would start to kind of need this like I need to just switch it up for a little while. So that might just be, all right, well, I'm going to train for a mountain 100-miler or a trail 100-miler, spend 4 to 6 months doing that, and then go back to the more like primary target for me once I've kind of taken a break from it. And the way I look at it then is like, for someone like me, I think like picking a very specific event to make kind of something you really want to perfect, that's great. but you should diverge from that occasionally just to kind of stay well-rounded, stay interested, stay motivated, stay hungry, stay healthy to some degree. I also notice that like when I'm spending too much time training for a very specific ultra marathon, given that I'm training on a very like kind of monotonous, one-dimensional type of mechanic type of a course, I just start to break down where, I mean, there's things I could do to correct that. And I do that when I get in longer stretches of training for those type of races now. But if I'm kind of just intuitively blending in a trail running style of training, it sort of corrects for a lot of that because you're exposing yourself to some different mechanics and almost like strength movements if you're running on steep enough trails to some degree too.
Yeah, it's so interesting, and I think you're probably the best person placed to answer a question like this one. When in terms of running 100 miles, what are some of the different emotions that crop up inside your head?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it's a pretty wide range. It can go from like almost like like an overly zealous amount of optimism early on because everything feels so easy. You're tapered, you're rested, most people are probably running a little too fast, but it still feels too easy. So the temptation to like get out ahead of yourself. So I think one thing that I think is really tough to avoid, but it's good to be aware of is early on in a 100-miler, you're going to be able to easily run a pace that's too fast. And then what sometimes happens then is people start kind of reinventing their expectations for the day based on that sensation. So you may have like a really lofty goal 10 miles in, all of a sudden this lofty goal isn't aggressive enough. And now you're way out over your skis and you blow up and end up running like, dropping out perhaps, or like arriving hours short of like your C goal or something like that because you just got a little too ambitious. So that's one side of it. Then you kind of get to a spot, I think, that stands out to me in most 100-milers where you hit a spot where you're like at the duration or the distance of where you did your longest long run at. And you're kind of in this spot where, okay, now from here on, it's basically like reflecting back on my previous experience at this distance. You can sort of hack that to some degree by doing like, say like 80K, 100K type distances in preparation for a 100-mile, but those have to be pretty strategically placed if you want to make sure they're not interrupting your training too much. But even if you do that, you're still, let's say you do 100K, you're still looking at, 37 and a half miles, or what would that be, like, I think 62 kilometers or something shy
there's
of.
There's an untapped distance that's left there for you to
Exactly.
still experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you sort of get to that point where it's like, all right, I'm kind of getting back into really like rarely charted waters, but I do have fatigue in my legs because no matter how fit you are, 100 kilometers is still 100 kilometers, or 40 miles is still 40 miles. And like all these different distances that are still quite long, but not nearly close enough to the finish line of a 100-miler to start feeling like, okay, I can just like put my head down and grind. Like you don't want to be in a position to have to put your head down and grind when you have 60 kilometers to go. It's just too long to be going through that process. So it's, to some degree, it's like you got to get over that hurdle. You got to get over that hurdle where instead of thinking of it like linearly of, okay, I feel the residual impact of the running I've done so far, and if this continues, it projects me to be in this level of discomfort at the finish line, and that level of discomfort is just intolerable. It levels off and sort of becomes this, you get to a point where the discomfort doesn't really get worse, but it just doesn't go away. So it kind of switches from a physical battle at that point to a mental battle of how long can I sustain this kind of lower hum of discomfort for an extended period of time. Versus what you notice in things that are a little shorter, like a 5K, it's a little bit more like this is a pretty sharp, pretty focused, pretty intense level of discomfort. And you're just kind of white knuckling it because it's going to be over in a few minutes. It's different from that.
You can make it be over quickly. If you go quicker, it's going to be over quicker. That's great, because I think so many people listening to this, their initial experience with running will be those short bursts of effort that are painful for a short period, but it dissipates really quickly. Whereas what you're explaining is that the pain arrives and the pain just stays, but it's maybe not the sharp, searing pain that you get with your lungs burning when you're running as fast as you can. It's much more on a level and coasting along. That's such a key consideration when somebody's considering like, oh, how on earth does that sit at that pace? I mean, the pace you run at is obviously incredible as well, but how does that possible to stay within that? But you're saying that it's sore, but it doesn't become sorer. It's just consistent and stays.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Where I mean, I think it probably is a little more linear for the shorter distances where you start, you kind of learn where that path lies and like where the loading zone is inside of like the fairly tight parameters there. And you just expect it like 1 kilometer into a 5K should feel like this. 2 should be a little bit of an escalation to feel like that. 3. And if you're hitting those stages that you've confirmed through your prior good performances, you kind of know based on how you're feeling if you're kind of heading in the right direction or not. Whereas, yeah, with the 100 miler, there's such a big range of just kind of like how you can actually hack that sensation where like you might actually feel better at mile 80 than you did at mile 65 and be moving quicker. And that sensation is just not going to really present itself likely in a shorter distance race that way. So you have to be aware of that because when you hit a rough patch, it gets so easy to think, okay, it's really bad right now. I'm having a hard time focusing on even the next kilometer or mile. And I've got 30 or 40 of these to do yet, though. And if you think it's going to get exponentially worse or even linearly worse from there, it's going to be self-defeating to the degree where you're either going to like concede your true expectations or drop out. And what you really want to do there is think like, okay, this is just a wave that I'm riding or a trough, I guess, in that scenario that eventually I'll get through and then I'll feel better at some point. And I just kind of have to like narrow my focus, know that it'll get better and kind of just keep focusing on short-term goals until you do get to that point where all of a sudden you're feeling better, all while still paying attention to things that can drive how often or frequent that happens, which is things like fueling and hydrating and just like taking care of yourself essentially.
Is chunking down one of the key strategies then when it's getting harder? So 1 more km, 1 foot in front of the other, keep your pace, keep your rhythm. Is that a strategy that you've relied upon?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's something too where there's no level of things that would seem incredibly trivial if you just sit down and think about it prior to the race as motivators will become motivators. I remember at one point when I early 100 milers, I remember thinking like I was in a bit of a rough spot and I just told myself I need to find a distraction from thinking about 100 miles. I need to be thinking about something more immediate. And I thought, okay, in 4 laps, I'm going to grab a bottle of water. And I just fixated on that bottle of water. And it's just like, that's what distracted me from thinking about all the 100-mile part that would have allowed my brain to kind of continue to spiral into the negative and instead start focusing on a positive, which was something I could see progress quite easily. When you're counting down from 4 laps, you can literally, even 100 meters at that point is progress in your mind because it's like, reasonably close to the goal. So like finding things that are going to just essentially just distract you from overly thinking about the grand goal and focus on the immediate goal that is required to get to the grand goal so that you're not burning cognitive energy, like stressing about things that are too far down the road to be worried about at the time.
What do you think are some of the most common emotional mistakes that runners make during a 100-miler?
I think a lot of times it's sort of what I just said, where they emotionally think I need to get to the finish line and you shouldn't be thinking about the finish line yet. Or they have like a set of goals that they are set out for the day and they're starting to slip behind like one of the top goals. Okay. And they give up on that one because they responded to adversity too early versus like saying, okay, I'm in a low point now. Although I may be not making great progress towards my top goal in the moment, that doesn't mean it's off the table. I mean, you may arrive to a point where it's off the table and then you have to be motivated enough with your B goals and your C goals and things like that to keep positive and keep going. But a lot of times I think people give up even on their A goals too soon. I mean, I know I have in the past where it's like, all right, I hit a rough patch and now all of a sudden it seems like what I'm going to have to do with the final 20 miles is more difficult than it was supposed to be on the plan going in, but it's not impossible. But since it's not ideal, you sort of kind of concede it to some degree or entirely. And that I think is what you really want to try to avoid. It's one of the hardest things too, because it's really difficult to not think about the finish line of a 100-miler because that's what you're there to do. You're there, you're at minimum there to get to the finish line. And then on top of that, you may have expectations of how quickly you get there.
Of a time,
so, yeah. So kind of finding a way to kind of have that in the background operating because I don't think you're going to eliminate it altogether. It's going to be pretty rare where you find yourself in a situation where you're out there and you're not even aware that you're doing a 100-mile race. You're going to be aware that you're doing that. But you want to have that to be such a low bandwidth operating thing in the back of your mind that all your cognitive focus can be spent on what's the next goal, what's the next thing I need to do right. And I think when people can get into that, they find themselves being more successful on the emotional, cognitive side of the sport. And a lot of it is just learning when you can practice it outside of the race itself, because it goes back to what we were talking about before, where you're not going to actually experience the 100-mile distance in training. So you do have to like project and try to plan for something that you're not going to have done recently or ever in some cases if it's your first 100-miler. And that's where I think you use your most race specific workouts to kind of do some sort of like mental work, where rather than just going out and doing a really long run for the sake of preparing yourself physiologically for the race itself, but also doing it to prepare your mind, where say I'm doing a 3 to 4 hour run and I'm going to try to cover somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 miles. I'm thinking that entire 30 miles as if I started that run at mile 70, and I'm just visualizing what it's going to be like to tackle that last 70 miles. And if I'm doing it with some fatigue in my legs from the prior day's training, it's even better, because then I'm sort of in the physical position as I would be too, a little depleted. And then I'm just out there thinking like, okay, because at that point in time, thinking about 30 miles is a pretty aggressive thing to do. I'd be much better off trying to get done with the first 5 before I start thinking about the next step and the next step. But you're just making that process a little more intuitive. So you don't feel like you're fighting to get there on race day. You feel like that's the natural state. And when you deviate from it, it's just a sign of, oh, I need to pull myself back because this isn't a healthy spot for my mind to be in right now.
Something I'm always really curious about is post-event feelings. And I've spoken to friends that have done ultras, and maybe Fergus Crawley, who introduced us, he's done like the double brutal, and he talks about the post-event slump. How do you handle that elation of, you've just run your 11-hour 100-miler, Zach, you've got the record, people are hyped for you, but then you have to go back to life and whatever comes next? How do you handle that a few weeks afterwards?
Yeah, it's a good question. That particular example maybe is a little harder to answer, because I broke a 25-year-old world record at the time. So the amount of like interest in that one specifically had such a long tail, right to the degree where I got a second interview on Joe Rogan for it. So there was like months of just sort of like, it almost felt like
it's what everyone wanted to talk to you about.
Right. Yeah. So it was sort of, and I was like, the funny thing about that particular race too, is that was supposed to be a training race towards another one. So I ended up having I wasn't at the end of my season yet. And I had a couple other like exciting races I did before the end of the year that were sort of like, one particular was like getting a monkey off my back. Kind of, there's this 50-miler out east called the JFK 50 mile. And I had done it twice in a row early in my career when I hadn't done 100 miles yet at the time. I'd just done 50 milers, and I just had terrible performances there. Like just like bad race plan strategy, like subpar execution, like underperformed by a huge margin of what I was capable of. And I went out to that race that year and ran really, really strong. Like I ran the race I should have ran those other 2 years. So it was like there was sort of like some momentum continuation type things happening that year too, that kind of made that like kind of post-race letdown probably, when I probably experienced it the most was well into the next year, when we had a scenario where I didn't even have the option really to just keep the ball rolling. That usually has a downside to it, by the way. So like you eventually kind of burn out. You got to take an off season eventually. But what happened to me is the pandemic came. It's like, I had like some ambitions to go after some fast times in early 2020. Those all got wiped off when races all canceled for the most part, in at least the early parts of 2020. And the landscape of running was just shifted differently. So then it was kind of like, okay, I need to step back and figure out like, what am I actually doing this for, so that I don't get overly invested in this, this one experience. And for me, that was a lot of stuff that I had done prior, and just recognizing that those are still really important, in some cases just as important things to me. And that was just a lesson I think I learned early. Was I had this goal to chase the world record for 100 miles. And at the very least, I was comfortable with a scenario where I didn't get it, but I walked away from the 100-mile distance thinking, okay, I got the most out of myself. And that's what it was the result. So like kind of reflecting back on like, what are you really trying to do with this? And where are the outlets when you can't actively focus specifically on that? So
what were some
that
of those
was,
for you, Zach?
I mean, that was just everything else I built around it. So like the coaching side of stuff, the podcasting side of stuff, just engaging with other runners and things like that. Like everything that I would do outside of the racing side of things. And that's where I think that this is the interesting thing about ultra running now is we're at a point now where true professionalism is on the table for people who are, finding themselves on podium of competitive races. So you sort of have this situation where we're making this transition that wasn't 100% available to me, at least in a sustainable method, in my opinion, when I started, which is I could just wake up in the morning and train, rest, recover, rinse, repeat, and then race, and then do that process over again. And then there's very little there's very little structured outlets outside of that, where if you have a bad race, if you hit a slump in training, if you get injured, if you get sick, where do you turn your attention to stay excited about things and stay motivated about things when you aren't going to be able to be humming on all cylinders on the thing that you're prioritizing? So
Your
for me,
identity can be stripped from you, which is probably one of the worst things that somebody can experience in terms of what defines them is not available to them. So that I find it fascinating that it's actually a risk for these guys if they turn fully pro ultra, that they don't have these other pillars in their life that they like stand for, whether it's family, whether it's different areas of their career or their business. It's kind of important to have more than one leg that you're standing on.
Absolutely. And it's also something, there's a gap between the physical limitations and the mental stimulation that you can sustain. So if you're physically peaked for 100-mile race, like optimally, and that was the only thing your mind was really like centered on, it probably hasn't been actively stressed and worked enough to really prepare for a full like race that's going to take, like, in some cases, like, well, I mean, the range goes on forever, but like we're talking like well beyond what you would typically do for a training run. Like UTMB gets won in like 19 hours, and that's an incredibly fast time. So it's like, how do you train the mind to be active and tolerant of staying on for long durations like that without actually running to get that? Because that's not going to be sustainable. And I think that can be done through other passions and other hobbies that are mentally or intellectually stimulating. So for like me, if I go and do a 3-hour training run, I get the mental stimulation from that. I get the physical stimulation from that. Once I eat, shower, get myself sorted, hop into podcasting or something like that, I'm still mentally stimulating myself. So there's a balance there that I think is useful to getting to a spot where you feel like, all right, I have the cognitive bandwidth to be able to tackle this effort. And also I think it's just like to kind of go back to the original like point or question was like, what is the actual why that you're here for? So if my why was, well, I just want to go and break records, well, I mean, there's going to be an end to that at some point where I either no longer can do it, or other people come along that are just better than me and they do it to such a high level where it's out of my reach. And then it's like, well, what's my why now? Why am I even here if that was my only reason? So I think to some degree, like that at that time frame, you kind of just sit down and you really unpack, what is it that you're actually curious about? What is it that's actually motivating to you outside of some of these like cool things? Like, it's really fun, it's really exciting, it's really like awesome to break a world record. But if that was my why, then I probably wouldn't be running right now any longer. But since my why is like the process of building and kind of finding like, what happens when I do this input, what result do I get, how much progress do I get from this approach versus that approach? And that's something that can be applied to so many other things that you just kind of switch over, where it's like, okay, I kind of have a little bit of a dampening of how much emphasis I'm going to put on training and racing right now as I kind of recover from that last buildup and figure out what I want to do next. Well, there's a whole world of, podcasting growth or coaching growth or, any of these other things that I'm interested in that I can dive into and kind of refocus that primary set of passions on in the meantime before I'm ready to kind of like steer back towards training and racing again.
That's so healthy. I'm not sure if you heard the Rogan episode with Will Storr. He's the author of a book called The Status Game. I had him on the show, and the status game is what we're all kind of infinitely playing depending on which area we're in. And some of us are playing it on only one particular area. So it could be the guys playing it only in the world of breaking records. If that becomes stripped from him, his fall from that height is so sore and so powerful and so demeaning that he ends up in a terrible position. Whereas if that was stripped from somebody like yourself, who's got so many other facets in other areas, and it's not his only wine, it's not his only driver, you're much more protected from losing the Zach Bitter that we all look up to and are inspired by and learn from, because you've got these other areas of your life that you care about and you pour your energy forth into as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, that is it. Like, you won't see me just like disappear when I'm no longer competitive. I'll be out here doing stuff. Whether people want to pay attention or not is their choice. But it's, I'm interested in kind of putting information out and kind of being involved in the running community for a long time. So, or even the fitness and nutrition side of things too. I think that stuff's all really interesting, and there's definitely big groups of people also kind of passionate about that stuff. So yeah, I mean, it's really about kind of figuring out what is actually motivating to you at the core of it, minus kind of the cherries on top. Because races, that's kind of what racing is at the end of the day, is like, it is sort of a celebration or an extension of what you were already going to do anyway. And I think when you can kind of get into that mold, when you do have a day like I did when I broke the 100-mile 12-hour world records, it's like, wow, this is like just a level of like enjoyment that I wasn't necessarily expecting to have, but it's cool to have it. It's cool to experience it. Put that in that category of things that I'll look back on at the end of my life as like, what a cool way to kind of cap off that journey, versus feeling like it's something that I have forever or should be, that I'm entitled to experience on the regular. Because I think you got to be comfortable with your very best outcomes not being the norm, not being something where that you feel entitled to experience that all the time. If you make that the expectation, you're just going to fall short all the time. And then you stop using failures as lessons, and you start looking at failures as something that's keeping what you deserve from you. And that's just such an unhealthy way to go about life, in my opinion. And you see it, I think sports are probably the best. Professional sports are probably the best example of that, where you have a scenario where they're super competitive and the timeline of your potential is very short relative to other careers or other projects that one could engage with. And it's just eventually going to be something where you reach your pinnacle much sooner than you reach a typical, like, kind of twilight phase of a person's life, where, let's say you build a big company, a big business or something like that, and then you retire at a more traditional age. Society's kind of set up for you to accept that and say, oh, I'm just at that point where I'm moving on to a new stage of my life. My friends, my family members, they're all kind of doing that too now. So you don't feel like out of place. But with athletics, it's different, because that day can come in your 30s. I mean, in some cases it can come in your 20s. And it's like, what are you going to do then? You've got everyone is still building at that point.
That's so true. That's so true. What role does your wife's own ultra running success play in the family? How important is that?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely took different approaches. My wife, Nicole, she got very invested in her career early. So for her, I think, like, when she got she didn't necessarily have a scenario like I did either, where it was like, okay, well, this is something that's easy enough to come back to if I would decide to, where she kind of had to maybe pick, do I focus primarily on one or the other? Or she had to be honest with herself. Am I going to be happy with the decision to go pro as a runner at the expense of my career? Where I think where we differ is I'm way more interested in a lot of the like subtopics of running and ultra running and things like that. She's very much interested in the preparation and the racing side of it. But outside of that, I don't think she's nearly as like curious about the sport as a whole. Like, you're not going to catch her picking up a book and reading about the history of the 100-mile in the 1700s. Whereas you will see me doing that. So for her, she needed to find an outlet outside of the sport itself to make the running side sustainable, Or the other way to look at it is like her job is something that matches her personality well, in that it keeps her very organized. It leans into her skill set where she's like very good at just like having like a calendar of objectives and remembering when things go where, organizing it, presenting it in a really good manner, and not having any lapses. But when she comes to running, that's like her outlet from that. That's like her, okay, I don't have to be on point. I don't have to be like in this environment of like, if I mess this up, there's a cascading effect. So everyone's relying on me to make sure that like I'm sharp. For her, running is like, I'm not even going to wear a watch. I'm just going to go out and I'm going to like move my body and, and run. And then so oftentimes like I'm telling her what to do for a given run or a given day's training session, because she doesn't even want to deal with like, what that entails. And I mean, she's a really good runner though. She was like a Division I recruit out of high school. So she has the background of, oh, I know why I would do this, or I know what it feels like to do this type of workout. So there's not like a knowledge gap there, but it's a lot more healthy for her to have a very different world outside of ultra running to make ultra running sustainable for her. So she's coming into it as a kind of more of an outlet from her career, a career that she enjoys. So that's where the big difference is. I think like when I step away from running and dive into my career, it's more running just from different avenues. Whereas when she steps away from running, it's like she could be like totally out of context from even thinking about the running behavior or the running world and things while she's engaging in that stuff. And she likes that larger polarization, where I like that more kind of like, where can I build within? How can I actually expand this one topic? If that makes sense.
It makes so much sense. And at that level of awareness of each other and your drivers and your motivators is so key. And that's why somebody like yourself will make a fantastic coach in the space, because you're just always wanting to learn and talk about running and share that piece of information. And one of the best ways for us to reinforce the lessons that we want to learn ourselves is to teach on to others. Whereas if your wife wants that period of switching off and focusing on the day job and progressing the career, and then goes to the running and just so happens to be a brilliant runner because of her expertise and her focus in it, but isn't necessarily somebody that wants to spend all day every day talking about it on podcasts or talking about it to everyone she speaks to, then it's important to recognize those two. And that level of understanding of how you're wired and how Nicole's wired is such an important thing for people to consider, because sometimes you see people be great at a pursuit or even a hobby or an activity they do and decide to make it their career. And that's something that can be a real mistake in that regard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think, I mean, it's one of the lessons I think that was probably one of the best things I learned when I got into coaching, and to the degree where like I restructured the way I kind of have my coaching set up a few years ago. And it was based strongly in that principle of, if you can get to somebody's why and figure out what it is authentically and what they're trying to actually get out of it, then it really helps dictate the actual nuts and bolts of coaching philosophy, where like whether there is a perfect training philosophy that like if done right everyone would be better at is sort of irrelevant outside of like working with maybe the very best at the discipline. Because and the only reason why it's important there is because they've whittled things down to such a fine level of performance that like a fraction of a percent matters. So if your life input doesn't match that, you're just going to get teased out of that level of eliteness in the sport, and someone else will slide in and take your spot. So it sort of selects for people who respond well to whatever probably the most ideal training philosophy is for a given distance or intensity. But when you start working with people across the spectrum of potential and abilities and finishing times and things like that, you start to realize that it has to match those other elements of their life, because those other elements are just going to be much more weighty than the person who can build an igloo around themselves and just focus entirely on preparation for a very specific event, the way like an Olympian might. So, so I mean, I think it's really interesting to kind of have that setup where it's like, where you think about it like, well, in this situation, I would program this workout. in that situation, I would program that workout. And those might be very different workouts where I think intuitively the thought is like, there's the right workout and there's small iterations around it. And it can be a lot more wide in scope than that in some
There's
cases.
more
So
nuance.
exactly. And I think it adds a level of excitement as a coach too, because you're not just working with carbon copies of the same person over and over
Yeah,
again.
people aren't robots, Zach. People
Mm-hmm.
are so different. There's so many different things going on inside people's lives outside of the pursuit where they've decided they're going to undertake an ultra or some extreme physical pursuit.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think like a big win. I mean, obviously I always want my coaching clients to have successful races, but like a big win for me as a coach is like, if I have a coaching client who has a race and something went wrong and they like, they didn't quite hit their top tier goals and they walk away from it saying, oh, I mean, I learned so much. I had so much fun doing that. I'm excited about, you know, going into it next. I know the training I did will pay forward and eventually I'll have a day where I feel like everything clicked. Like that's what I'm oftentimes trying to get to with it. So, because I think that's kind of the healthy way to go about it. Because if you're just, it becomes a microcosm of the professional athlete if you don't, where the expectation becomes, I need to perform at the highest of possible levels at all times, or it's not worth it. And in which case, then maybe it's better to find a different hobby.
Absolutely. One of the final questions I want to ask you about, Zach, and I'm conscious we haven't gone super deep on nutrition, which I know you've got so much insight to add on, but I'm really interested from a mindset and a lessons perspective. Given all the different experience and expertise you've got, what's an area that you still are always learning about, always working on, always trying to find out a little bit more?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say like probably there's a couple things. I would say one would be just like stress management. So stress is something where I find interesting because obviously there's stress that's clearly negative where like you can recognize in the moment like this isn't healthy. I need to avoid situations like this or it's going to negatively impact me being productive in the areas I want to be the most productive in. But there's also like relatively healthy stressors that you just have to be very, very mindful of how much bandwidth you have. It kind of goes back to what we were talking about in the beginning, where there's a lot of different things you could be doing. There's only so much you have time for. So finding where those balances end up being from like one training cycle to a next is always challenging because it changes to some degree. And I mean, an example of that would be like my wife and I moved from Phoenix to Austin almost 3 years ago at this point. But it's like that was an exciting experience. Like we were very excited to move to Austin. There was a lot of cool new things, a lot of interest to be here, a lot of opportunities. But it was also a lot of inefficiencies and a lot of new learning, a lot of things. So it's like, how do I scale things in a way where I can manage that stress to be within like a healthy loading zone so I don't end up suffering at everything at the expense of trying to be great at all of it. And kind of just always kind of finding where that new balance lands based on just like an evolving world and an evolving landscape and things like that. That's probably the thing that I'm the most interested in at the moment in terms of just like how it, and part of that's probably just because now I'm balancing a little bit, maybe more than I have in the past when it comes to the coaching, podcasting, and training racing side of things. You know, as all of those grow, they just become more potential for those versus maybe early on when you're like kind of in the earlier part of the journey on a couple of them, then they maybe aren't as stressful because there's not as many opportunities in them yet. And that's kind of that evolving landscape though.
And just through sheer size, new problems or challenges or curveballs will probably come up. So, for example, handling the sponsors on the podcast is a problem at episode 300
Yeah.
and 400 and 500, whereas in episode 1 to 100, you're probably not as concerned about, okay, well, did I get the ad read right? Or have I got the right CPM for this particular person? So, like, problems of abundance will come your way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And some of it is like, podcast is probably a good example for this because it's growing so fast. Now there's an insane number of podcasts, and a lot of them are just basically like sort of dead end. I don't want to say failures because I would hope that people learn something from the experience at least, but there are a ton of podcasts out there. So whenever you have like sheer numbers like that, you're going to have the people who get it right and you're going to have competition within it. So it's growing because people are listening to them. So like you do want to make sure you're keeping that forefront of like this is a growing landscape. So focus on what you're good at, focus on what you're interested in, and be consistent with it, and you'll find your way. But you're also trying to make sure that you're not like getting left behind with new innovations and things that like people who typically download a podcast would be looking for in order to get like the best experience, because the quality is just going to be better out there than it was. But when I started podcasting, it was like, oh, you can upload an episode with just god awful audio quality because people who are into podcasts aren't picky because it's like they want access to this specific topic and this is the only spot to get it. Now it's like, oh, I've got this topic I'm interested in. There's 4 dozen experts out here and this person's aesthetics of their episode recording is way better. So I'm going to head over that direction. So, I mean, that's one thing, is just kind of keeping up with the professionalism of the world within that kind of topic is definitely
it's a layer of
something
stress.
That's changed. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But it's a welcome stress, Zach, just based on you making sure that you're giving your all to the things that you've chosen you care about, which are in a particular set domain which you've agreed upon in advance.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. To some degree, you look at that through other life experience and you say, this isn't something I should be surprised by. This is just part of growth. And, I experienced a huge growth in ultra running and all the changes that came with it, and I managed to adapt within it. And, podcasting is the same way. Coaching is probably a little bit earlier in that phase with ultra running specifically, but it will get to that point too, where you have a scenario where now all of a sudden, like, the expectation from the coaching client is much higher because the amount of people interested in refining their coaching skills is so detailed that people want to be working with the people who've done that versus the person who's just like, oh, I've had this experience, I'll show you what happened to me.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, even from my friends that do online fitness coaching, the standard of coaching that's delivered in terms of the check-ins, the Loom videos, the programming is so different to 5-10 years ago when it was like a PDF and an Excel spreadsheet that somebody was sent to do their check-in. It was very, very basic indeed. Now it's a much more complicated, much more skilled process that people go through.
Yeah, now you have like third-party applications that are aggregating data about sleep quality, HRV, and all sorts of different metrics, and then AI assistants and things like that. So yeah, it's an interesting world for sure.
That's it, Zach. I've had a tremendous time. I'm sure the listeners have as well. If they want to continue the conversation with you, where should they head towards?
Yeah, really appreciate you having me on. It was a lot of fun to chat. I think we covered some really fun topics. But yeah, if they want to check out more of what I'm up to, like, the best spot to find everything is my website at zachbitter.com. From there, you can leap to my podcast, coaching stuff, social media channels, probably most active on Instagram, which is just at zachbitter.
Wonderful. That'll be linked in the show notes, Zach. Thank you to you, and thank you to the listener. I'll be back to speak to you all again very, very soon.